In 258 AD, in the heart of the Roman Empire, a young man was slowly roasted alive on a metal grid placed over an open fire. As the flames licked his body and the scorching iron seared his skin, witnesses claimed to have seen something beyond human comprehension. He was smiling, even more astonishingly, when his torturers intensified the flames to increase his agony. Instead of the expected screams, they heard words that would echo through history. "Turn me over. I'm done on this side." These words were not madness or delirium. They belonged to Saint Lawrence, a young Christian deacon whose death became a symbol of faith's triumph over the most horrific tortures the ancient world could conceive. Lawrence's martyrdom was not merely an instance of religious persecution, it carried far deeper significance. In an empire where death had become a spectacle and the most brutal punishments were reserved for those who defied the established order, it revealed the complex interplay between power, faith, and human endurance. This execution was not designed merely to kill, but to break the will of the entire Christian community through the public display of unimaginable suffering. What makes Lawrence's story so haunting is not just the brutality of his execution, but the deliberate psychological warfare behind it. Roman authorities understood that the manner of one's death could either terrify or inspire the public. That is why they chose the gridiron, a method of slow, controlled death that would maximize both physical pain and public humiliation, believing it would prove the futility of Christian resistance. But the empire's meticulously planned demonstration of power backfired in an unexpected way. The crowd, expecting faith to crumble under extreme pressure, instead witnessed a scene that shattered everything they thought they knew about human nature and divine will. The man who should have been screaming spoke clearly, even mockingly, as if the flames consuming his body were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Early church historians, such as Prudentius, recorded not only Lawrence's final words, but also the calculated cruelty that led to them. Accounts later confirmed by scholars like St. Ambrose revealed that this was not a spontaneous act of rage, but part of a deliberate campaign aimed at stripping the Christian Church of its resources, leadership, and ultimately its hope. To truly understand what happened to Lawrence, we must journey from the Spain of his youth, through the influential corridors of papal power in Rome, and into the mind of an emperor whose persecution of Christians became legendary for its systematic brutality. Only then can we grasp why the death of this young deacon resonated so deeply, and how he transformed the very empire that sought to destroy him. The year 258 AD was a turbulent time for the Roman Empire. Emperor Valerian ruled over vast territories stretching from Britain to the Euphrates, yet his grip on power was weakening. Economic crises devastated the provinces, barbarian invasions threatened the borders, and most significantly, foreign religions that challenged traditional Roman values were spreading rapidly among slaves and citizens alike. Christianity, once a small Jewish sect, had grown into a powerful movement that threatened the religious and social order of the empire. Valerian's approach to the Christian problem differed significantly from that of his predecessors. Whereas earlier emperors had pursued sporadic, localized persecutions, Valerian launched what historians now describe as the first systematic, empire-wide campaign of religious genocide. His edicts of 257 and 258 targeted not only ordinary believers but specifically the clergy and wealthy Christians who formed the backbone of the church. The emperor's strategy was cold and calculated. Rather than wasting resources on mass executions of ordinary believers, he sought to decapitate the Christian movement by eliminating its leaders and confiscating its wealth. Bishops, priests, and deacons were ordered to participate in traditional Roman religious ceremonies or face execution. Christian cemeteries were sealed, communal worship was banned under penalty of death, and Christian nobles risked losing their wealth and social status. Rome had become a powder keg of religious tension. According to modern historians, Christians made up about 10% of the city's population and were becoming increasingly organized and visible. They operated extensive charitable networks, managed underground burial sites, and most provocatively refused to participate in the imperial cult that was the glue holding the empire together. Refusing to offer incense to the emperor's image was seen not merely as religious defiance, but as treason against the state itself. The papacy under Pope Sixtus II embodied everything Valerian feared. No longer just a loose association of individual believers, the Roman Church had developed a sophisticated administrative structure, amassed significant wealth through donations, and maintained an extensive network throughout the empire. The papal treasury, managed by deacons like Lawrence, funded not only local activities but also Christian communities across the known world. During this turbulent period, Lawrence rose rapidly as Rome's chief deacon, effectively the church's chief financial officer and one of the most influential figures in the Christian hierarchy. His position made him both a prime target for Roman authorities, seeking to seize church wealth, and a powerful symbol of Christian resistance to imperial authority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of both Roman cruelty and Christian faith. Lawrence's journey from the hills of Hispania to the papal palaces of Rome reads like a classic story of rising success in the ancient world. Yet the very talents that brought him to prominence would also seal his fate. Born around 225 AD in what is now northeastern Spain, Lawrence grew up in a unique Christian community shaped by a blend of Roman culture and local traditions. The church in Hispania was renowned for producing leaders who combined deep theological knowledge with practical organizational skills. The young Lawrence caught the attention of church leaders early, not for mystical visions or miraculous healing, but for his exceptional ability to manage people and resources. When the future Pope Sixtus II met him during a visit to Spain, he immediately recognized in Lawrence the administrative talent the growing Roman Church desperately needed. The Pope's invitation to Rome represented not only an extraordinary opportunity, but also a tremendous risk. Rome in the 250s was a city of stark contrasts for Christians. On the surface, they could live in relative peace at times, conducting business, raising families, and even holding minor public offices. However, beneath this seemingly normal life lay a constant threat for Christians. A small change in imperial policy, a local incident, or a false rumor could turn ordinary citizens into enemies of the state overnight. For a young man from the provinces, navigating this environment required extraordinary skill. Lawrence's rapid rise within the Roman Church hierarchy was a clear reflection of both his personal abilities and the urgent needs of the Christian community. As chief deacon, his responsibilities extended far beyond managing the church's finances. He was also in charge of organizing charitable works, maintaining the complex network of relationships that kept the Christian community functioning, and overseeing the entire system. This meant that he not only knew where the church's treasures were stored but also knew the names and locations of all Christians in the city, information that was invaluable to Roman authorities. The role of a chief deacon in the 3rd century church was far greater than modern readers might imagine. Lawrence was not merely an accountant, he was effectively the administrator of an alternative social welfare system. The Roman Church fed thousands of poor people daily, supported widows and orphans, ransomed slaves, and provided burial services for those who could not afford them. This extensive charitable network made Christianity attractive to many, but also made the church wealthy, and therefore threatening. In the eyes of the Roman state, by 258 AD, Lawrence had become one of the most recognizable figures in Roman Christianity. His position required him to interact regularly with both Christians and pagans, making him a bridge between two worlds that were increasingly at odds. He was well versed in Roman culture and law, spoke fluent Latin and Greek, and possessed the social skills needed to navigate the complex political landscape of the imperial capital. These very qualities that made him so effective in his role would make the torture he would later endure even more shocking to those who witnessed it. On August 6 to 58, the arrest of Pope Sixtus II sent shockwaves through the Christian community in Rome. Acting on direct orders from Valerian, Roman soldiers raided a Christian service in the underground cemetery of San Callisto, seizing the Pope and several deacons. The timing was deliberate. Catching Christian leaders in the act of violating imperial edicts provided legal justification for the punishments that followed. Within hours, Sixtus and his companions were executed, their deaths serving both as punishment and as a warning. Lawrence, who had not been present at the fatal gathering, now found himself the highest-ranking Christian official still alive in Rome. The weight of this responsibility was immense. Thousands of believers looked to him for guidance, while Roman authorities saw him as the key to dismantling the remaining structure of the church. This made Lawrence both the most important and the most hunted man in the Christian community. The Roman prefect, acting on Valerian's specific orders regarding the confiscation of church property, summoned Lawrence for interrogation. The meeting, held in the prefect's official residence, felt less like an arrest and more like a negotiation. Roman law regarding the confiscation of property was complex, and the authorities needed Lawrence's cooperation to seize the church's wealth legally. The prefect offered what appeared to be a reasonable bargain: surrender the church's treasures, and perhaps we will spare your life. The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental difference between the Roman and Christian worldviews. The prefect, thinking in terms of gold, silver, and precious stones, wanted to know where the church's wealth was hidden. Lawrence, however, understood treasure in an entirely different sense. He therefore asked for 3 days to gather what the church valued most. The Romans interpreted this as a sign of cooperation and granted his request, unaware that they were now part of a plan that would completely upend their expectations. During those 3 days, Lawrence worked tirelessly to distribute the church's material wealth to the poor, sell valuable items to provide assistance to Christian families, and secured the safety of as many believers as possible. He knew his time was limited, and that every action he took in those final days would determine not only his own fate, but also the future of Christianity in Rome. Every decision carried immense consequences for people whose lives depended on the church. The psychological pressure he endured during this period was beyond measure. Lawrence knew that accepting the Roman offer would mean betraying everything he believed in, while refusing it would mean a death designed to inflict the greatest possible suffering. Yet historians report that he approached this impossible choice with extraordinary clarity and even humor. It was as if he understood that his death could achieve far more than his life. This foresight would prove unexpectedly accurate for both him and his executioners. On August 10th, 258, Lawrence appeared before the prefect as promised, but what he brought with him overturned every Roman expectation. Instead of chests filled with gold and silver, he arrived accompanied by the city's poorest residents, the blind, the lame, the widows, and the orphans. Pointing to them, he said, "These are the true treasures of the church." The impact of this act of courage cannot be overstated. In a society where wealth meant power and poverty meant shame, Lawrence had inverted Rome's core values. The people whom Romans considered worthless slaves, beggars, and social outcasts were, in Christian understanding, the most precious treasures on earth. This was not mere religious symbolism. It was a direct challenge to the entire imperial ideology. The prefect's rage was immediate and intense. What had begun as a simple attempt to seize property had turned into a public humiliation. Roman officials were accustomed to seeing fear and submission from those they interrogated. Instead, they faced a man who seemed unimpressed by their power and who mocked their demands. The carefully crafted legal process established by Valerian was now overshadowed by the urgent need to reassert Roman authority. The decision to execute Lawrence by roasting him on a gridiron was not a spontaneous outburst of anger but a calculated act of psychological warfare. The Romans understood the power of spectacle, and public executions served multiple purposes: punishing the criminal, deterring potential offenders, and providing entertainment for the masses. The method chosen for Lawrence was designed to be slow enough to inflict maximum pain, public enough to have maximum impact, and brutal enough to crush any notions of Christian heroism. The gridiron itself was a feat of engineered torture. Made of parallel iron bars, it was designed to distribute heat evenly and prevent the victim from dying too quickly. The condemned would be tightly bound to the metal frame and placed over a carefully controlled fire, allowing a slow, deliberate roasting that could last for hours. The heat was kept high enough to inflict unbearable pain, but regulated to prevent quick death from shock or smoke inhalation. Roman executioners were skilled professionals, well versed in human anatomy and the mechanics of death. They knew how to keep the fire at the ideal temperature, maximizing pain while ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. The positioning of the body, the timing of the turns, and the feeding of the flames all were meticulously calculated to create a spectacle that would burn itself into the memory of every witness, both Christian and pagan. When news of the execution spread across the city, the execution ground filled with people. Everyone came to witness the public torture of the infamous Christian deacon. Citizens seeking entertainment, believers praying for their leader's soul, imperial officials ensuring the emperor's orders were followed, and curious foreigners drawn by the spectacle. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, fear, and a barely restrained sense of violence. Lawrence was brought forward in chains, but contemporary accounts emphasize his composure rather than any signs of panic. Executioners were skilled at reading condemned men, and they typically saw one of two reactions: total psychological collapse or a false bravado that quickly crumbled under torture. Lawrence, however, displayed something entirely different, a calm that seemed genuine, not forced, as if he were walking toward an appointment rather than his execution. The gridiron had been prepared with characteristic Roman efficiency. The iron bars glowed red-hot, positioned at precisely the right height above carefully arranged coals. The executioners had tested the temperature, hot enough to burn and cause excruciating pain instantly, yet measured enough to avoid a rapid death. This was knowledge harnessed for suffering technology in the service of terror, cold engineering aimed at breaking the human will. As Lawrence was stripped and bound to the metal grill, a deep silence fell over the crowd. This was usually the moment when the condemned began to scream, beg for mercy, or call upon their gods. But the silence that followed was more unsettling than any cry could have been. Instead of the expected moans, witnesses heard something that defied comprehension. Lawrence was speaking, not in desperation, but in the tone of a man making casual conversation. The physical reality of what was happening to his body was horrific. Human skin begins to burn at around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius. The gridiron was far hotter than that. The iron seared his flesh wherever it touched, leaving geometric patterns of burns across his back and limbs. The air filled with the sickly sweet smell of burning flesh, a stench that made even battle-hardened Roman soldiers nauseous. But something was going wrong with this carefully staged scene. The man who was supposed to be screaming was speaking with clarity. The prisoner who was expected to beg for mercy was instead delivering what witnesses later described as theological reflections. The Christian who was expected to curse his God was praising him. Rome's machinery of terror was facing something it had never encountered before, a victim who refused to be victimized. As the flames grew higher and the iron bars burned hotter, Lawrence's demeanor became even more incomprehensible. Instead of the expected breakdown, he continued what witnesses described as an extended conversation with his executioners, speaking with a lucidity that suggested complete mental clarity. Despite the unimaginable physical trauma, officials trained to recognize the psychological stages of torture-induced collapse now found themselves dealing with something completely outside their experience. The most famous words Lawrence spoke during his torture have echoed through the centuries. Asimest versa iti manduca, I am cooked on this side, turn me over and eat. The Latin phrase, recorded by multiple witnesses, was not the product of madness but of clever wordplay. By comparing himself to meat being prepared for a feast, he was both making a joke and mocking his executioners for failing to break his spirit. This was not the desperate humor of a man losing his sanity. It was calculated defiance wrapped in wit. The psychological impact on the executioners was immediate and profound. They were used to screams, pleas, and eventual surrender. Their knowledge of how torture affected the human mind and body made them effective instruments of imperial justice. But now they faced a prisoner who seemed to be directing his own execution, offering advice on technique and appearing completely unfazed by his situation. Some Romans who had come expecting to witness cowardice were instead confronted with a scene that shattered their assumptions about human nature. The crowd grew restless. The spectacle was not unfolding as they had expected. Some whispered of divine intervention, others of supernatural powers. The execution, which was supposed to reinforce Roman authority, was instead provoking questions about the very nature of that authority. Following procedure, the executioners turned Lawrence over, but their actions now seemed to follow his instructions rather than their own. Every adjustment of the grill, every manipulation of the flames appeared to occur at Lawrence's suggestion rather than according to Roman design. The dynamic between torturer and victim had somehow reversed, with the man being burned alive becoming the dominant figure in his own execution. Contemporary Christian writers recorded additional statements from Lawrence during his ordeal, including prayers for the conversion of Rome itself and expressions of gratitude for being deemed worthy of martyrdom. Whether these details are historically accurate or later embellishments, they point to something almost unheard of in Roman execution records: a victim who transformed his suffering into a platform for proclamation, rather than a reason for surrender. The public reaction to Lawrence's execution is considered one of the most remarkable examples of mass psychological transformation in the ancient world. What had begun as a routine imperial spectacle The destruction of an enemy of the state was slowly turning into something entirely different. The spectators who had come expecting to witness the absolute triumph of Roman power over Christian weakness instead found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, weakness, and the very nature of victory. The social makeup of the crowd made this transformation even more significant. Those gathered were neither Christian sympathizers nor spiritual seekers. They were ordinary Roman citizens who had internalized imperial values. They understood the purpose of a public execution and their role as witnesses to imperial justice. Yet, as Lawrence's torture failed to meet their expectations, their confidence in familiar social categories began to crumble. Roman executions followed a predictable rhythm. The condemned would first show defiance, then gradually submit under the weight of torture, and finally beg for mercy or death. This sequence served more than entertainment. It reinforced the message that Roman power was irresistible, cemented social hierarchies, and made clear the consequences of defying authority. Lawrence's execution, however, was demolishing this well-established order. Murmurs began to rise among the crowd as witnesses struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. Some reverted to traditional explanations. Perhaps Lawrence was under the influence of a spell, or maybe the gods were testing Rome's resolve. Others began whispering that the Christian God might actually be more powerful than the Roman deities. Most unsettling of all, some spectators started questioning whether the Romans were, in fact, the villains in this scene. This transformation was neither immediate nor uniform. Different sections of the crowd reacted differently, leading to debates, tensions, and growing unease. Roman officials quickly recognized the danger. Public executions that turned the crowd against the executioners had historically led to riots, political crises, and direct challenges to imperial authority. What had begun as a display of strength was now threatening to become a display of weakness. The turning point came when, after hours of torture, Lawrence raised his head and addressed not his executioners, but the Roman prefect himself. According to reports, he thanked the official for the opportunity to demonstrate his faith and prayed that the Roman Empire would one day embrace Christianity. This final act of defiance, or perhaps of grace, stunned even the most hardened Roman officials into silence. Lawrence's death was as unexpected as the rest of his execution. After hours of torture, he did not die with screams or curses, but with what witnesses described as a prayer of thanksgiving. The man who had defied every Roman expectation of human behavior continued his defiance until his final breath, transforming his death into an act of worship rather than defeat. Chaos followed immediately after the execution. The crowd that had come seeking entertainment now found itself grappling with an experience that fit into none of its familiar categories. Roman authorities, realizing that their show of power had somehow become a demonstration of Christian triumph, moved quickly to disperse the spectators and regain control of the narrative. But it was too late. Too many had witnessed something that contradicted the narrative of Roman superiority and Christian weakness. News of Lawrence's ordeal spread through Rome within hours. With the speed that only the most shocking events achieve, the details varied in the telling, but the core remained unchanged. A Christian deacon had been executed by the most horrific methods Roman ingenuity could devise, and yet he had turned his suffering into victory. In a city accustomed to clear distinctions between victors and victims, this was deeply unsettling. The Christian community's response was swift and unprecedented. Instead of being cowed into submission, as Valerian's persecution had intended, Roman Christians drew strength from Lawrence's example. The sheer brutality of his execution, combined with his extraordinary response to it, created a powerful symbol of resistance that imperial power could not suppress. The martyr they had created had become more dangerous dead than he had ever been alive. Roman authorities quickly realized their mistake. The execution meant to demonstrate the futility of Christian resistance had instead given Christians their most powerful symbol yet. Lawrence's death was now seen not as proof of Roman might, but as evidence of Christian victory over imperial power. The empire's most sophisticated instruments of terror had been rendered powerless by one man's refusal to be terrorized. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Christians began openly professing their faith, despite ongoing persecution. The charitable networks Lawrence had dedicated his life to protecting were revived with renewed vigor. Most importantly, many Romans began to question a faith that could inspire such courage in the face of such unimaginable suffering. The execution had achieved the exact opposite of its intended goal. The martyrdom of St. Lawrence marked a turning point in the relationship between Rome and Christianity, even if its full implications would not be understood for decades. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Valerian's persecution actually intensified, as imperial authorities recognized that their methods of suppression were backfiring. Yet this escalation also revealed the growing desperation of an empire struggling to contain a faith that seemed to grow stronger with every attempt to destroy it. Within the Christian community, Lawrence's death became the gold standard of martyrdom. His administrative skill, theological wisdom, and unparalleled courage in the face of torture inspired generations of Christian leaders. More importantly, his ability to transform suffering into testimony taught Christians that suffering could be redemptive as well as destructive. The church that emerged from Valerian's persecution was stronger, more organized, and more resolute than the one that had entered it. Roman society, too, was transformed, though in ways imperial officials feared most. Hundreds of people who had witnessed Lawrence's execution carried their testimony throughout the empire. The story of the young deacon who mocked his torturers while being burned alive soon became one of the most powerful tools of Christian evangelization. Lawrence's death demonstrated that the strength offered by Christianity could be far deeper and more enduring than the physical brutality of Rome. What had been staged as a terrifying spectacle meant to intimidate and turn people away from the faith instead became a powerful instrument of propaganda, drawing more people toward Christianity. The ideas that took shape in the wake of his death deeply influenced the early Christian doctrines of suffering and redemption. Church fathers such as St. Ambrose and St. Augustine built profound theological frameworks upon Lawrence's example, developing insights into how individual suffering could serve a higher cosmic purpose. Lawrence had proven that suffering was not merely destructive, but could also be a path to salvation, a concept that would become central to Christian belief. His death was as politically significant as it was theologically profound. Lawrence's ordeal revealed that the seemingly absolute power of Rome actually had limits. The state could punish the body and inflict pain, but its ability to control minds and souls was far more limited. This realization contributed to a profound shift in imperial policy in the years that followed, eventually paving the way for the Edict of Milan in 300, which granted Christianity legal recognition. Perhaps the most important outcome was the redefinition of the relationship between temporal and spiritual power. As Lawrence's death showed, if a person could preserve their dignity, faith, and even sense of humor under the most brutal torture, then there clearly existed a realm beyond the reach of physical force. This understanding was a turning point not only for Christianity, but also for Western thought on human rights, human dignity, and the limits of political authority. The story of St. Lawrence continues to resonate centuries after his death because it touches the core of universal human concerns, human nature, suffering, and the search for meaning. Today, we may like to think of ourselves as having left behind the barbarities of the past, but Lawrence's example reminds us that both cruelty and the capacity for resistance remain fundamental aspects of the human condition. What makes his story so powerful is not merely the horrific torture he endured, but his response to it. In a world where victimhood is central to our understanding of suffering, Lawrence presents a radically different perspective: victory through apparent defeat. His refusal to be broken by pain, his ability to maintain his humanity, and his transformation of his death into an act of worship challenged the very foundations of how we understand power, weakness, and triumph. Lawrence's martyrdom also raises profound questions about the relationship between faith and reason. How can we explain behavior that contradicts everything we know about human psychology and physiology? What does it mean that a person could maintain clarity, compassion, and humor while enduring torture that should have reduced him to desperation? These questions may have no simple answers, but they suggest that human potential runs far deeper than we often assume. Ironically, the Roman Empire that killed Lawrence eventually became Christian. Whether this transformation represented genuine conversion or political calculation remains a subject of debate. But one thing is certain: the empire that produced saints like Lawrence was fundamentally different from the one that had tried to destroy them. The values for which Lawrence died, aid to the poor, the dignity of every individual, and the supremacy of the spiritual over the material, became the foundational pillars of Western civilization. Today, as religious persecution continues in many parts of the world, Lawrence's example remains both an inspiration and a challenge. His story demonstrates that no political power, however mighty, can ultimately defeat individuals willing to suffer for their convictions. At the same time, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own willingness to make sacrifices for the principles we claim to cherish. The man who smiled while being roasted alive on a Roman gridiron left behind more than just an inspiring story of saintly heroism. He gave us a profound meditation on the nature of human dignity, the source of true strength, and the possibility that what appears to be defeat may, in fact, be the highest form of victory. In a world still wrestling with questions of power, suffering, and meaning, the deacon from Hispania, who became Rome's most unlikely conqueror, continues to offer lessons that time itself cannot erase.